Imagine for a second that you have access to a functioning time machine.
Oh, man. The possibilities.
Right. I mean, you have the entirety of human history at your disposal. You could witness the construction of the pyramids. You could stop a major political assassination. You could even just go forward a few decades and steal next century's stock market data.
Which is probably what most people would actually do.
Exactly. But instead, you use this godlike technology to travel back to the year 1975. And you do it for the sole purpose of retrieving a 50-pound, wildly obsolete portable computer from an IBM lab.
It sounds incredibly underwhelming.
It really does. It's an underwhelming use of temporal displacement, but that highly specific, bizarrely mundane mission is actually the foundational hook of one of the most sprawling, intricate legends to ever emerge from the internet.
Yeah, it really is.
So welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves entirely in the story, the lore, and the cultural history of John Titor.
The self-proclaimed temporal scout from the year 2036.
That's the one.
And that hyper-specific focus on a piece of 1970s hardware is exactly why the story survived. I mean, it didn't rely on sweeping generic science fiction tropes. It was anchored in a very real, incredibly obscure technological mystery.
Right, and before we really get into it, I want to explicitly state the mission of this deep dive for you listening. We are not here today to debate whether John Titor was a real time traveler.
Spoiler alert, he probably wasn't.
Right. Instead, our focus is entirely on the story and the history of this fascinating internet phenomenon. We want to look at how it started, the incredibly detailed lore, the community's reaction, and its lasting cultural impact.
It's really a pioneering masterclass in digital myth-making.
It absolutely is, and we have a massive stack of sources for today's exploration. We're pulling from text transcripts of the original forum posts from 2000 and 2001, archived IRC chat logs, and even the contents of physical faxes sent to the Coast to Coast AM radio show.
We also looked at Wikipedia articles, a documentary simply titled John Titor Time Traveler, and some really great YouTube analysis from the channel Retro Recipes.
Yeah, the retro computing angle on this is wild because, like we teased, this story involves a 1975 portable computer, a hidden feature confirmed by real-life engineers, and a sprawling narrative that went on to inspire hit anime and early alternate reality games.
The architecture of the myth is just, it demands our attention. Long before alternate reality games became, corporate marketing tools, the entity known as John Titor was organically crowdsourcing a science fiction universe in real time.
And doing it on early internet message boards.
Exactly, using them as the canvas.
So let's track the genesis of this narrative, because the character of John Titor didn't actually debut on the internet.
No, he didn't, which is a really interesting detail.
Right. The entire saga begins in an analog format. It essentially exploited the premier broadcast hub for fringe culture in the late 90s, which was Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM.
For anyone unfamiliar with that show, it was a late-night syndicated radio program that catered heavily to, truck drivers, insomniacs, paranormal enthusiasts.
The perfect audience for this. So, on July 29, 1998, a fax comes through to the studio, and the sender writes, "Dear Art, I had to fax when I heard other time travelers calling in from any time past the year 2500 AD. Please let me explain."
That opening line is it's a brilliant piece of psychological positioning.
How so?
Well, by referencing other time travelers who had supposedly called into the show, the author immediately flatters the host. He validates the entire premise of the radio program while simultaneously establishing his own superior authority.
Oh, like, those guys are fakes, but I'm the real deal.
Exactly. He's essentially saying, those other callers are amateurs. Let me give you the actual mechanics of temporal physics.
And the technical mechanics drop almost immediately in that first fax. The sender claims time travel was invented in 2034, stemming from offshoots of fusion reactor research at CERN.
The European Organization for Nuclear Research.
Right. They describe producing the world's first contained singularity engine. But then, almost out of nowhere, the narrative shifts from theoretical physics to immediate apocalyptic dread.
Yeah, the tone shifts drastically.
The fax predicts a massive Y2K disaster. It details people freezing to death on highways, the institution of martial law, and an impenetrable temporal barrier. Oh, and the total collapse of the federal government. It even specifies a power facility in Denver being mobbed and completely destroyed.
You have to remember, the author was leveraging the very real simmering anxiety of 1998. Y2K wasn't just some fringe conspiracy. Billions of dollars were being spent globally to patch legacy code.
People were genuinely terrified the grid would go down.
They were. The fear of critical infrastructure failure was totally mainstream. And the facts takes that mainstream fear and pushes it to its absolute catastrophic extreme. And then, like you mentioned, adds that layer of cosmological horror.
Yes, the cosmological horror part of that fax is, I think, the most unsettling detail in our entire stack of sources.
The brick wall.
The brick wall. The sender states that if a traveler attempts to go forward in time from 2036, they hit an impenetrable brick wall in the year 2564.
Where nothing exists.
Exactly. Everyone who pushes the singularity engine to that date reports that nothing exists, just total blackness and silence.
It creates a hard boundary for the universe he's constructing. But then there's a second fax.
Right, where the author urges Art Bell to stop fearing the Russians, claiming they will eventually save this country.
Yeah, and after that second fax, the trail goes completely cold.
Yeah.
The author vanishes for over 2 years.
It isn't until October 14, 2000 that the narrative reactivates, and it does so in a completely different medium.
We shift from analog radio faxes to a text-only IRC room.
Yeah, so looking at the archived IRC transcript, it shows a few users casually chatting. There's a user named Yaresa and another named G-Degree, or G0, who says he's a 30-year-old from England.
And then another user operating under the handle time travel responds. He says, "My name is John. I'm 38 and a time traveler from Florida."
So casual. And G-Degree asks the natural, mundane question of whether he's staying with his parents, and John says yes, he's just visiting. And then he drops this absolutely surreal detail. He says, in fact, the me on this world line is upstairs asleep. He's too.
That juxtaposition of the domestic and the impossible is what makes that line so incredibly effective.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a quiet suburban Tuesday in Florida, and the man at the keyboard is claiming his toddler self is sleeping in the bedroom right above him.
It's cinematic, really.
It is. It establishes the rules of his universe instantly, without requiring a dense paragraph of exposition.
I want to ask you about this timeline, though, because why start with the fax to a radio show and then wait 2 years to jump into a random IRC chat room? What does this say about how internet storytelling was evolving right at the dawn of the millennium?
It highlights a massive shift in how the internet was operating between 98 and late 2000. In 98, a fax to a radio station is a one-to-many broadcast. The author throws the lore out into the void and just hopes Art Bell reads it on air.
Right, there's no feedback loop.
Exactly. But stepping into a live IRC chat room, that completely changes the stakes. You can't just deliver a monologue in an IRC room. You have to be prepared for the interrogation.
Because people are going to ask questions in real time.
Real time. The transition to peer-to-peer interaction is the moment this went from a standard piece of creative writing to a collaborative performance. By engaging directly with these users, the author invited the audience to stress test the fiction.
And to survive that stress test, he had to have the underlying physics of his world flawlessly mapped out.
And he really did.
He did, because when John eventually moved from the IRC chats to the Time Travel Institute message boards, he didn't just tell stories about the future, he dropped technical schematics.
Right, because if you were going to claim to be a temporal scout, you need the hardware to back it up.
So we move from his introduction to the actual science he presented to the world. Titor provided an exhaustive breakdown of the C204 time machine.
He classified it as a stationary mass temporal displacement unit, and he claimed it was manufactured by General Electric.
GE, of all companies. Which is brilliant. I spent a lot of time looking at the photos of the C204 that he included in his posts. Because if you ask someone to picture a time machine, they usually default to something glowing, sleek, very Hollywood. Like a DeLorean.
Right, lots of neon and stainless steel.
Exactly. But the C204 looks like heavy industrial garbage. Instead of Hollywood flash, it's bolted into a Chevy with the mundane, utilitarian look of military spec surplus gear. It's a black metal box covered in yellow and black caution tape, warning labels about dangerous magnetic fields, analog dials.
It even has a coiled telephone cord attached to a remote control unit.
It looks exactly like a piece of military surplus gear you'd find rusting in a decommissioned silo somewhere.
And that anti-aesthetic is entirely deliberate. By making the machine look heavy, dangerous, and decidedly unglamorous, the author bypassed all those typical science fiction tropes that trigger immediate skepticism.
It feels grounded.
It lent the story an air of gritty, bureaucratic realism. The fact that it was supposedly manufactured by GE, which is a massive, boring defense contractor and appliance manufacturer, just adds to that grounded reality.
The technical specifications he listed on the forums are incredibly dense. He stated the machine was powered by 2 topspin dual positive singularities that produce a standard offset Tipler sinusoid.
Now that is a fascinating detail. Frank Tipler is a real physicist who published a paper in 1974,
Okay.
and in it he described how an infinitely long, incredibly dense cylinder spinning on its longitudinal axis could theoretically create a frame-dragging effect.
Frame dragging.
Basically, if you accelerate a ship around that spinning cylinder, the warping of space-time would create a closed, time-like curve, and that would allow you to move backwards in time.
Wow. Okay, so it's based in actual theoretical physics.
Yes, but the obvious engineering flaw in Tipler's theory is that the cylinder has to be infinitely long to prevent the math from collapsing at the ends.
Which you can't exactly fit into a car?
Right, and Titor anticipated that critique from the physics buffs on the forum. He explained that by utilizing contained microsingularities, essentially microscopic black holes, the C204 could simulate the massive gravitational frame-dragging effect of the Tipler cylinder without requiring an infinite physical structure.
That is so smart. He detailed the components required to manage that, too. An electron injection manifold to alter the mass and gravity of the microsingularities, a complex cooling and X-ray venting system, gravity sensors, and an array of 4 main cesium clocks.
To keep the unit anchored to local time coordinates.
Right. And he claimed this 500-pound box was originally installed in the rear suspension of a 1967 Chevrolet Corvette convertible for his trip from 2036 back to 1975.
Which is another bizarrely specific detail. Why a 67 Corvette?
He claimed the electronics in the 1967 vehicle were completely analog, meaning they wouldn't be fried by the intense electromagnetic fields generated by the Singularity engine.
Oh, that makes sense within the lore.
Yeah, and he later transferred the unit to a 1987 four-wheel drive truck for his stopover in the year 2000. It's an incredibly tight internal logic, but the hardware mechanics are only the first hurdle, because the second he posted this on the forums, users hammered him with the classic grandfather paradox.
The fundamental philosophical trap of all time travel narratives.
Right. If you travel back in time and accidentally run over your own grandfather before he meets your grandmother, you are never born. If you are never born, you can never travel back in time to run him over.
So I was waiting to see how the author would handle this, because most sci-fi either ignores it completely or invents some convoluted destiny loop where you were always meant to go back.
Titor's solution was elegant because he leaned entirely on an existing, highly respected branch of quantum mechanics, the Everett-Wheeler model.
Better known as the many worlds interpretation.
Exactly. The many worlds interpretation posits that quantum wave functions never actually collapse. Instead, the universe branches into distinct, non-communicating realities for every possible quantum outcome.
And Titor adapted this to macroscopic temporal mechanics.
The way he explained divergence to the forum users was fascinating. He stated that there is no single, absolute timeline. The instant you power up the C204 and move backward along the time-like curve, your mere presence alters the gravity of the new coordinate.
You do not travel back on your own world line. You arrive in a newly created parallel universe.
And he quantified it. He claimed that upon his arrival in our year 2000, his timeline was roughly 1 to 2% divergent from ours.
A 2% difference means the macro events are largely identical, but the micro details are slightly off.
He gave examples on the board. He mentioned looking around our year 2000 and seeing car models that never existed in his world line, or noticing that certain books were published a few months late. The most dramatic example he gave was a specific skyscraper in New York City that simply wasn't built in his universe.
We really have to analyze the profound narrative utility of this 2% divergence rule. From a storytelling perspective, relying on the many worlds interpretation is the ultimate architectural defense mechanism. By explicitly stating that his arrival creates a divergent timeline, Titor rendered all of his future predictions completely unfalsifiable.
Oh, wow. It's totally bulletproof.
Exactly. If he predicts a major event will happen in 2004, and the year 2004 comes and goes with nothing happening, the forum users can't call him a liar.
He simply shrugs and says, well, my mere presence here must have altered the sequence of events. Our timelines have diverged.
The 2% divergence is a brilliant narrative shield. It allows the audience to fully buy into the stakes of the story and engage with the horror of his predictions without the author ever being cornered by reality. It is a masterstroke of interactive fiction design.
But a bulletproof timeline and a cool machine don't equal a story. A protagonist needs a motivation, a quest.
Right. Why stop in the late 20th century at all?
Exactly. Having a time machine is one thing, but why was he here? The entire reason John Titor supposedly stopped in the year 2000 was just to visit his family and retrieve some old photographs on his way back to 2036.
His actual destination was 1975.
Right. As a member of the 177th Temporal Reconnaissance Unit, his primary mission was to travel to 1975 to retrieve an IBM 5100, or 5110. He occasionally conflated the two in his posts, but the 5100 series is the crucial element.
Let's break down what this computer actually was, because it is absolutely vital to understanding why this story exploded.
Released in 1975, the IBM 5100 was technically one of the first commercially available portable computers.
But portable in 1975 meant it weighed about 50 pounds, was the size of a large suitcase, and cost almost $20,000.
Incredible.
It had a tiny 5-inch CRT screen built into the chassis and a magnetic tape drive. It was primarily used by scientists and heavy industrial firms.
And Titor claimed the scientific community in 2036 desperately needed this specific archaic machine to solve a looming infrastructure collapse caused by the UNIX year 2038 timeout error.
And the 2038 problem is not fiction. It is a very real, well-documented issue in computer science. It is essentially the Y2K bug, but for UNIX-based operating systems.
To understand the stakes Titor was establishing, we really need to look at how 32-bit architecture handles time. UNIX systems measure time as the number of seconds that have elapsed since midnight on January 1st, 1970.
A moment known as the UNIX epoch.
Right. The problem is that a 32-bit signed integer has a mathematical limit. The maximum value it can store is basically 2,147,000,000.
So if you just keep counting seconds from 1970, you hit that absolute maximum limit on January 19, 2038 at 3:14 a.m. UTC.
And when the clock ticks 1 second past that maximum limit, the integer overflows. Because it's a signed integer, it flips from the highest possible positive number to the lowest possible negative number.
The computer systems will suddenly believe the current date is December 13, 1901.
And if a database that manages power grids, satellite telemetry, or banking transactions suddenly thinks it's 1901, the logic gates fail and the systems crash.
Titor claimed his post-war world in 2036 was facing this exact crisis. They needed to translate and debug legacy code running on ancient mainframe architecture to prevent their recovering digital infrastructure from collapsing again.
But the forum users immediately challenged this, and I would too. Why do you need a 50-pound IBM portable from 1975 to fix C code on a UNIX system?
They could use almost any modern machine to write a translation script.
Right, so how on earth did the author of these posts justify this? And this is where he deploys the absolute most fascinating, deeply buried factual nugget in the entire legend.
The hidden feature.
Yes. Titor calmly replied that they needed the IBM 5100 because it possessed a highly classified, undocumented hardware feature. He claimed IBM engineers had secretly built an emulator into the 5100 that allowed it to natively read, debug, and run microcode from much older, massive IBM System 360 mainframes.
He elaborated that the 5100 could seamlessly translate between APL, BASIC, and the older mainframe languages.
And he claimed IBM deliberately suppressed the existence of this emulator function. Why? Because the System 360 mainframes cost millions of dollars and generated massive revenue for IBM.
If corporate clients found out they could buy a $20,000 portable machine that could essentially emulate their $1,000,000 mainframe, it would cannibalize IBM's entire business model.
Exactly. So they hid the function in the hardware microcode. And Titor added a personal touch. He was chosen for this retrieval mission because his paternal grandfather was supposedly one of the lead engineers on the IBM 5100 project.
When Titor posted this, it sounded like a convoluted, paranoid tech thriller plot point. It sounded exactly like the kind of fake corporate conspiracy a science fiction writer would invent to give their protagonist a reason to travel.
A classic MacGuffin, but it wasn't fake. And this is the real-world validation that elevates the story from a simple hoax to a masterclass in myth-making. A real-life, retired IBM engineer named Bob Gubb, who had actually worked intimately on the 5100 series in the mid-70s, publicly came forward.
And he confirmed that Titor was telling the absolute truth.
He did. The Hidden System 360 emulator existed. It was written into the read-only storage, the ROS microcode of the machine, as a massive cost-saving measure during development so they wouldn't have to rewrite the complex APL language from scratch.
You have to understand, in the year 2000, this was an incredibly obscure piece of hardware trivia. You could not simply boot up a search engine, query IBM 5100 secrets, and find a wiki page about it.
Right. The internet wasn't like that back then.
No. The documentation was buried in proprietary manuals or locked in the memories of a few dozen aging engineers.
The cognitive dissonance this caused on the forums was staggering. I tried to put myself in the shoes of a skeptical forum user in 2001. You're arguing with a guy claiming to be from the future. You think he's a complete fraud.
Naturally.
You start researching his claims to debunk him, and then you discover that he possesses highly specific, practically classified knowledge about the hardware architecture of a 25-year-old computer, a fact confirmed by an actual IBM engineer.
It creates an incredibly powerful psychological short circuit for the reader. It forces them into a position of vulnerability.
How do you mean?
Well, if the author is undeniably right about this seemingly impossible-to-know detail from 1975, the brain naturally extrapolates that he might be right about his claims regarding 2036. Anchoring a wild science fiction narrative to a verifiable historical fact creates this unshakable authority over the narrative.
It's the ultimate hook. He's got the gritty analog time machine. He's got the bulletproof quantum mechanics defense. He's got the verified, deeply obscure historical secret.
And having established total credibility with the audience, Titor then began to fully flesh out the world he claimed to come from.
And the future he painted for the forum users was relentlessly grim. While stopping in the year 2000, he began warning them about the dark alternative future of their timeline.
It was a timeline fundamentally defined by extreme conflict, political fracturing, and severe environmental devastation.
We have to look closely at this timeline of chaos Titor constructed. And it is important to note how heavily his world-building relied on the political and cultural divides of the late 90s and early 2000s. He didn't invent alien invasions.
No, he extrapolated contemporary American domestic issues to their absolute breaking point.
Before we detail these predictions, we must explicitly state to you listening that we are impartially reporting the contents of these original posts as pieces of internet fiction and lore. The sources mention political elements, Democrats versus Republicans, city versus rural, gun rights, things like that.
Right. We're absolutely not taking sides or endorsing any of the political viewpoints contained in the future scenario Titor described. We're just analyzing the story.
Exactly, just looking at the lore. So according to his narrative, the collapse begins with the Second American Civil War. He explicitly tied the start of this conflict to the year 2004, centering it around deep civil unrest following a presidential election.
The way he described the escalation was particularly chilling because it didn't happen overnight. He told the forum users that there wouldn't be a sudden cinematic explosion.
Instead, the Civil War would begin slowly. He characterized it as having a Waco-type event every month that steadily gets worse.
He was leveraging the fresh cultural trauma of the 1993 Waco siege and the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing to ground his fiction in a very recognizable reality.
The primary fracture, according to the narrative, was ideological and geographical. Specifically, a massive schism between urban populations and rural populations.
She described the cities becoming increasingly militarized and authoritarian, while the countryside became hostile, decentralized territory.
Titor mapped out how the United States eventually fractured into 5 distinct warring factions based on varying military and economic objectives. And he placed himself directly into the history of this conflict.
He claimed that he was born in 1998, meaning that by the year 2011 he was a 13-year-old boy living in this fractured reality.
And at that age, in 2011, he joined a Florida-based shotgun infantry unit that called themselves the Fighting Diamondbacks.
He detailed fighting a grueling, low-tech guerrilla war for 4 years in the Florida swamps against forces aligned with the urban centers.
But the domestic civil war was merely the prologue in his timeline. The absolute climax of his narrative arrives in the year 2015. He claims the Civil War is abruptly ended by the outbreak of a brief, completely devastating World War III.
A day he referred to as End Day.
The lore states that Russia launches a massive, coordinated nuclear strike against the major cities of the United States, Europe, and China.
He specifically named Washington, D.C. and Jacksonville, Florida, as targets that were completely vaporized.
He estimated the global death toll from the initial exchange and the resulting fallout at 3 billion people.
3 billion. And the geopolitical twist he added was fascinating. Titor claimed that in his timeline, the Russian nuclear strike was actually directed at the federal infrastructure of the United States.
Meaning that the rural factions Titor fought for suddenly viewed the Russians as uneasy, unintentional allies who had just wiped out their domestic enemy.
Following End Day, the geography of his United States is radically altered. With Washington, D.C. gone, he claimed the new capital of the fractured nation was established in Omaha, Nebraska.
I look at the world Teeter built, and it reads perfectly like a mashup of a classic dystopian novel and Old West frontier survivalism. It's a reality where survival dictates you ride a horse or a bicycle, you know how to strip and clean a firearm blindly.
You live in a tight-knit community of fewer than 50 people, and you treat any outsider with extreme suspicion.
The environmental world building for post-2015 America is incredibly detailed. He describes an essentially agrarian, survivalist society. He mentions that people refused to eat mass-produced or imported food because biological weapons were used extensively during the war.
So you only eat what you can grow in your own local community.
Right. And he heavily emphasized the destruction of the electrical grid due to high-altitude electromagnetic pulses, or EMPs.
Because of this, he noted that the mechanical typewriter made a massive cultural comeback, and that long-distance communication relied on a decentralized, self-powered node system maintained by local communities.
The narrative he constructed was incredibly potent. But why do you think these specific, bleak predictions found such a captive, obsessive audience on those forums?
Because the author brilliantly diagnosed the cultural zeitgeist of the millennium. The late 90s and the year 2000 were defined by a profound underlying anxiety. The Y2K scare, even though it's largely mitigated, proved to the general public just how fragile and interconnected our digital infrastructure had become.
There was a lingering fear that society was one bad line of code away from collapse.
Combine that with the hyperpolarization following the contested 2000 election and the rising awareness of domestic anti-government extremism.
Right. Teeter didn't need to invent new, unimaginable horrors to scare his audience. He simply acted as a mirror, reflecting the simmering anxieties the American public was already discussing in private.
He validated their fears by telling them, "You are right to be worried. The systems you rely on will fail, and the divisions you see now will eventually tear the country apart." It was strangely cathartic for the readers to have their anxieties given a shape and a timeline.
And because it was so cathartic, the forum users didn't just passively consume the story. As Teeter posted these grim predictions and complex physics on the Time Travel Institute and Art Bell forums, a diverse cast of characters began to interact with him.
They actively began to populate the story. Real people sitting at their bulky CRT monitors across the country began to form deep, complex relationships with this digital avatar.
The community interaction is what elevates this from a piece of writing into an entirely new medium of collaborative fiction.
The term often used now is unfiction. It's a storytelling format where the narrative is presented as absolute reality, and the players interact with the creator without ever breaking character or acknowledging that it's a game.
And the most prominent player in the John Teeter on fiction was a user named Pamela Moore. If you read through the hundreds of pages of archived posts, Pamela emerges as the secondary protagonist of the entire legend. She was his most frequent interactant.
She didn't just ask questions. She formed an intense parasocial bond with Teeter.
She claimed she had been having vivid dreams about a time traveler matching Teeter's exact description back in 1998, which she believed meant they had a profound cross-temporal connection.
She essentially assumed the role of his primary archivist and digital confidant. The dynamic between them added an emotional anchor to the cold, hard physics and apocalyptic predictions.
Teeter clearly recognized her value to the narrative. He gave her specific tasks. He supposedly provided her with a secret song that she could use to verify the identity of any future temporal scouts who might try to contact her after he left.
For years, rumor held that it was an obscure B-52's track, though later analysis suggested it was a song called Trism.
But the interaction went beyond the digital space. Pamela claimed that Teeter actually mailed her a physical artifact,
which is a classic tactic in alternate reality games, blurring the line between the digital form and physical reality.
She claimed he sent her a physical piece of an IBM 5110 label, and it arrived in her physical mailbox bearing an Orlando, Florida postmark. By sending a physical object, the author grounded the digital ghost in the real world.
But not everyone on the forums was as receptive as Pamela. For every believer, there was a fiercely hostile skeptic.
And the primary antagonist to Teeter's narrative was a user who went by the handle Javier Cortez.
Javier is the archetype of the internet forum bulldog. He was relentless.
He aggressively challenged Teeter, hunting for logic flaws in the timeline and the physics. In one incredible exchange, Javier lists out 9 distinct aggressive points trying to trap Teeter.
He demands to know why a highly trained military operative on a vital mission to retrieve a computer would waste months hanging out in an internet chat room showing off his time machine.
Which is a very fair point. Javier continually accused Titor of using manipulative debate tactics, avoiding direct answers, and preying on the gullibility of users like Pamela.
The friction between Javier and Titor was essential for the story's survival. If everyone had just agreed with Titor, the narrative would have stalled.
Javier's aggressive skepticism forced Titor to continually refine his lore, expand on his political philosophy, and defend the internal logic of his universe.
The most intense friction on the boards actually revolved around the ethics of time travel.
Oh, the philosophical debates. The forum users became genuinely emotionally invested, and they started getting angry at Titor. They would ask him, if you know there is going to be a devastating civil war, if you know a nuclear strike is going to kill 3 billion people, why won't you give us the exact dates, the exact names, the exact location so we can warn people and save lives?
And Titor's response to that ethical demand was brutal, but perfectly consistent with the rules of the universe he had built.
He used historical analogies to deflect the moral responsibility. He asked the forum, if the Egyptians knew the Red Sea was going to drown them, do you think they would have pursued Moses?
And then he posed a devastating hypothetical to his critics regarding Pearl Harbor.
He said, if you could go back in time to 1941 and tell the radar operators to take a second look at the radar screen on December 7th, would you? Before you say yes, perhaps you should go forward in time and see if the U.S. still had the motivation to make the A-bomb before Hitler did.
He was arguing a form of macro-temporal determinism. He essentially told them that the horrific suffering and conflict they were about to endure in their timeline were necessary catalysts for their ultimate survival as a species.
Furthermore, relying on the many worlds interpretation, he reminded them that warning them wouldn't save his timeline, it would only alter theirs. And he had no moral obligation to manage an alternate universe.
The psychology there is just absolutely fascinating. Why do you think real people, sitting in the year 2001, were experiencing genuine anger toward a stranger on a message board for refusing to save imaginary lives in a theoretical future war?
It speaks to the power of role play and the immersive nature of early text-based internet communities. When you invest hours of your life interrogating a premise, writing long, thoughtful challenges, and reading detailed responses, your brain begins to process the interaction as genuine social friction.
The users weren't just reading a sci-fi novel about a dystopian future. The author was looking directly at them and telling them that their specific future was going to be violently stripped away.
And because Titor never broke character, always responding with the weary, detached patience of a traumatized combat veteran, the emotional stakes felt incredibly real, even to the users who consciously knew it was a performance.
And then, just as he had mastered the manipulation of that community, he initiated his exit strategy.
In late March 2001, Titor announced that his stopover in the year 2000 was complete, and he was preparing the C-204 to return to 2036.
His final sign-off was a cryptic distillation of his entire survivalist ethos. He didn't offer a message of hope.
No, he urged the forum users to safely learn to clean and shoot firearms, to get a bicycle, and to closely read the Constitution. And with that, time travel logged off the forums and vanished.
He achieved the perfect digital disappearance, but he left behind a highly contagious narrative virus.
Because the internet never forgets. Titor vanished in 2001, but the community he built obsessively maintained the archives. And as the real-world timeline ticked forward, the dates he predicted began to arrive.
And pass.
The year 2004 comes and goes. There is no Second American Civil War. The year 2015 arrives. There is no Russian nuclear strike. Omaha does not become the capital.
As the massive predictions definitively failed, even with the 2% divergence rule attempting to run interference, the community's focus fundamentally shifted.
The question was no longer what will happen to us. The overriding question became who actually did this.
The pivot from deciphering the lore to hunting the author is when the John Titor story transitions into a true digital detective story.
And the paper trail they uncovered is incredibly compelling. In 2008, an Italian television program called Voyager, which investigated mysteries, actually hired a private investigator named Mike Lynch to definitively track down the identity of John Titor.
Lynch started digging through public records and, unsurprisingly, found absolutely zero registry evidence of anyone named John Titor existing in the United States.
But he did hit a massive structural anomaly.
He found a corporate entity.
Yes. Lynch discovered the John Titor Foundation, LLC. This was a for-profit company that had been legally formed in September 2003. And where was it based? Out of a rented post box in Kissimmee, Florida.
Florida, of course, being the exact state Titor claimed his family lived in, and the home of the fictional Fighting Diamondbacks militia.
Furthermore, independent internet sleuths traced the IP address associated with some of Titor's original forum posts, and geolocation data also pointed directly back to the Kissimmee and Orlando areas.
The geographic lock is tight. Lynch's investigation then zeroed in on the CEO of this foundation. It was a man named Larry Haber, who was a practicing entertainment lawyer in Florida.
Now, an entertainment lawyer is exactly the kind of person who knows how to properly copyright intellectual property, establish an LLC, and protect the merchandising rights of a viral story.
But a lawyer doesn't typically possess the incredibly deep esoteric knowledge of 1970s IBM microcode or the mathematics of a Tipler cylinder.
And that is where the puzzle pieces snap together perfectly. Larry Haber had two brothers, Richard Haber and Morey Haber. Both of the brothers had deep, extensive careers in computer science and information technology.
Morey, in particular, was involved in computer security.
You have the perfect trinity for the creation of the myth: a lawyer to structure the business and protect the copyright, and computer scientists who would absolutely possess the obscure, highly technical knowledge required to know about the IBM 5100's hidden System 360 emulator.
And the intricate details of the UNIX 2038 epoch problem.
Right. The investigator concluded that the Haber brothers were overwhelmingly likely to be the architects of the John Titor persona, and the financial motive was clearly established.
Because in 2003, the John Titor Foundation LLC actually published a physical book titled John Titor, A Time Traveler's Tale. It compiled the forum posts and sought to monetize the legend.
But framing it merely as a long con cash grab feels reductive. The level of detail, the sheer amount of time spent interacting with users, the intricate physics models, it requires a level of obsessive dedication that goes beyond a simple profit motive.
I completely agree. And the authors themselves seemed unwilling to let the story die a mundane corporate death. As the predicted dates failed, they attempted to patch the lore.
In 2009, a highly strange video was uploaded to YouTube by an account linked to the foundation. The video featured a text transcript that tried to execute a massive retcon of the universe.
It claimed, "I am one of the men you know as John. In 1999, I was the second to arrive on the same world lines."
That is a fascinating narrative pivot. By introducing the concept of multiple Johns operating across different overlapping timelines between 1998 and 2009, the authors were attempting to explain away the failed 2004 and 2015 predictions.
Right. If there were multiple time travelers leaving different measurements, the timeline was continually being fractured, thereby continuously expanding the 2% divergence gap. It was a retroactive software patch to the story's logic.
It's the ultimate attempt to keep the unfiction alive. Which brings us to the theory that I think best encapsulates what John Titor truly was.
The ARG theory.
Yes. In 2018, a man named Joseph Matheny spoke about the phenomenon. Matheny is a massive figure in early internet folklore. He is the creator of Ong's Hat, which is widely recognized by historians as one of the very first alternate reality games, or ARGs.
Matheny claimed that John Titor was not a hoax meant to maliciously deceive, but rather a deliberate literary experiment.
He essentially claimed it was a structural ARG, an interactive performance art piece created by people who had been directly observing the mechanics of his work on Ong's Hat.
Matheny stated he even acted as a consultant on the Titor project, advising them on how to manage the community interaction and maintain the illusion of the unfiction.
And if you look at it through the lens of an alternate reality game, it is an undeniable, staggering success. The cultural impact of the John Titor story entirely eclipsed the obscure message boards where it was born.
It really became a foundational text for a new generation of science fiction.
Look at its impact on Japanese pop culture alone. The entire legend was directly adapted and served as the core inspiration for the massive 2009 visual novel and the critically acclaimed 2011 anime series Steins Gate.
In that story, the protagonist literally interacts with a character named John Titor on an internet forum, learns about the many worlds interpretation, and goes on a desperate quest to track down an IBM 5100, altering a single letter for copyright purposes, to fix the timeline and save the future.
The legend permeated everything. It inspired stage plays, indie docudramas, countless video game Easter eggs, and even made its way into mainstream comic books.
Marvel Comics explicitly listed John Titor as an established alias for their premier time-traveling villain, Kang the Conqueror.
It has become a permanent, indelible part of our digital lexicon. So, after analyzing the mechanics of this story for the past hour, I pose this thought to you.
Let's hear it.
Even knowing the structural reality behind the curtain, knowing that it was overwhelmingly likely a collaborative, interactive fiction orchestrated by a Florida lawyer, his IT specialist brothers, and an ARG consultant. Does that unmasking make the story of John Titor any less impressive to you?
Absolutely not. In fact, I'd say understanding the architectural reality of the project makes it significantly more impressive. The John Titor narrative stands as a vital, pioneering piece of digital folklore.
The multi-platform approach alone was ahead of its time.
Exactly. Bridging physical faxes, radio broadcasts, real-time IRC chat, and asynchronous message boards. They grounded their fiction in verified technological secrets and synthesized the genuine cultural anxieties of the millennium into a cohesive universe.
They didn't just write a story for the internet to read. They constructed an entirely new reality and successfully invited thousands of people to live inside of it with them.
It really is the blueprint for modern digital myth building. From a pair of faxes sent into the late-night radio void in 1998 to a guy casually chatting about his 2-year-old self asleep upstairs.
To a sprawling, paranoid legend of hidden mainframe emulators, rotating microsingularities, and fractured world lines. It is a profound testament to our deep, inherent desire to believe in the extraordinary and our collective willingness to play along when the game is constructed with that much care.
And it leaves us with one final, deeply ironic thought to consider. We spend so much time debating the physics of his General Electric C204 machine and dissecting the math of the Tipler cylinder.
Right.
But while John Titor's physical time machine may have been entirely a work of fiction, his forum posts ultimately achieved a very real, tangible form of time travel.
But that's a great way to look at it.
About planting this incredibly sticky, hyper-detailed narrative into the digital bedrock of the year 2000, the authors ensured that their creation would successfully reach forward into the future. They permanently altered the cultural timeline of the internet, ensuring that decades later we would still be sitting here completely captivated, dissecting their words and keeping the legend alive.
They didn't need to manipulate gravity or harness a microsingularity to reach the future. They just needed a dial-up connection, a profound understanding of human psychology, and a truly unforgettable story. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of the John Titor legend. Keep your eyes on the world line, and we will see you next time.